Welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. Okay, so we have another great guest for you today. Her name is Dr. Karyn Edwards. Now, Karyn has a passion for supporting women in their career journeys. As a speaker and expert facilitator, Karyn motivates organizations and individuals through a strong focus on leadership essentials, powerful storytelling, and practical strategies. Karyn, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me to be on.
Karyn, I'm so glad that you're able to come on the show. I always want to start by asking people to tell us about yourself. Tell us about your journey and how you kind of got into this role that you're in right now.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go way back in my journey. Part of my journey started in elementary school, where I was actually diagnosed with pretty severe learning disabilities. And so I spent probably most of, from about kindergarten to fourth grade, I begged my parents to let me go back into the mainstream education system. And they did. So I struggled to figure out how to learn and what was unique about the way that I learned. And so I carried that with me throughout the rest of my education, throughout most of my career and work. And sort of how that applies to today is I had this feeling that I wasn't enough, that there was something based on how I was unique that made me different from everybody else, and that different wasn't good. And so it really took me a long time to overcome that. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that I do now is the empathy that I have for what I learned was everybody has something to work on, right? It doesn't matter. We don't have it all figured out. And so the work that we do with people in business, relating the psychological principles to that, is something that I've really found for me. It helps me every time that I work with someone because it reminds me that we all are unique and we all have unique challenges. I spent about 30 years, close to 30 years in corporate jobs, generally always in learning and development, organizational development, training, helping other people figure out how to have the best career for them. And so it's really been my passion for talent and developing people throughout most of my career.
Yeah, Karyn, I love that story, and that's such a great, unique experience that you have. You know, having gone through that, it allows you to have not just sympathy but empathy for other people that have this sort of challenging experience. I want to jump right into the work that you do because you talked about the way in which you're able to bring that experience to work, and I know that you focus specifically on supporting women.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that women have in the workplace, specifically when it comes to leading, and how you're able to help them overcome and manage some of those challenges, please?
Yeah, well, first of all, I love helping all leaders, regardless of gender or any of that. But I do have a space for women because of confidence. I find that there's something that happens along the way where girls, early in their development, start to worry about self-image, to worry about how they're showing up in the world, and it's things that we have to unravel way back into those years of sort of what caused that, and realizing all the strengths and abilities and gifts and differentiators that we have now. There's also just factors that are really present that are slowly changing, but there's all kinds of statistics about there's fewer women at the top. There's fewer women that maybe want to be in those top positions because as caregivers and mothers, a lot of women choose that route. And we still do more of the work at home than our counterparts typically. And again, these things are shifting and they're getting better all the time, but it's still present. And so for women to be able to send that extra email, to look over the presentation one more time, to do all those things that help set the bar a little bit differently. It's more challenging to do that when you have a lot of extra responsibilities. And so one of the things that I love to work with women on is I have this framework that I share, which to me there's three legs of the stool, if you want to call it that help all leaders be successful in organizations.
Mm-hmm.
But the first one is you have to be competent. So you have to know your job. You have to be technically competent in the products, competent in the industry that you're in, and know that industry. And that's really table stakes for anyone.
Hmm.
And then the second thing is you have to be have human competency, which is this is the part where we come in, where there's usually something that someone's still working on, right? It could be empathy skills, it could be navigating change, but it's really, are you navigating the self effectively?
Hmm.
And oftentimes those things are around stress management, impulse control, how we're communicating, a variety of things that show up to other people and can become barriers. And then the third thing that people generally evaluate us on in the workplace is accountability. So, do you do what you say you're going to do? Are you able to prioritize? Are you able to juggle the demands of different workload? And that's one of the things I think, women in particular are uniquely skilled at because of the societal role that we play. We develop those skills. And I'm not saying men aren't great parents or they don't do the same things, but there's just this ability that we have to develop that can be very beneficial in the workplace. And so those are the three things that I generally work with leaders on, and then women in particular.
Yeah, I love that model that you have, that approach that you have that addresses these very three specific things. I want to ask you a little bit more about what you were talking about when you brought up confidence, because you talked about how that's impacted by both psychological things but also social things in the environment that we're in. Tell us a little bit about how you see both the blend between psychology and the social environment and how that impacts leaders and their ability to lead in general.
Yeah, well, I have a great example, and I'm sure everyone can relate to this.
Hmm.
But women in particular get interrupted more often than men do when they speak in meetings or at work. And so, what happens from the psychology perspective is we're talking about something, we have all of our bullet points in our head, we've practiced, we're,
Yeah.
we're prepared for the meeting, and we've done our due diligence, and somebody interrupts you in the middle of a statement.
Hmm.
And what happens is your brain has to task switch. So you were talking, you were thinking about something, and then you have to switch over to listening and taking in new information at the same time managing the inner dialogue that's going, oh my gosh, I can't believe this person's interrupting me when I haven't finished even my first point.
Hmm.
And so your brain is doing a lot of work, and it's starting to increase your cognitive load. You start to get stressed. You get stress
Hmm.
responses, right? And so one of the things, there's a couple of things. One is when you get interrupted, you some in some degree have to take that in. You have to process that, and you do have to task switch. And at the same time, I think we can all be advocates for each other to say, if I was in a meeting with you and I said, wait a minute, I don't think Ernest was finished with his point. Can we hold that question for just a minute until, so we can advocate for each other. Because the challenge is when women do that for themselves, if I were to say, I'm sorry, Ernest, do you mind if I finish my point before I come to your, I get perceived as, kind of too aggressive, too assertive, right? But if somebody else does it for me or helps me with that, that is a socially acceptable way to do that. And I wish we weren't here. I wish this wasn't the case, right? That we could
Hmm.
just be assertive. And there are some cultures that I know that are great about that. But those are some things that I find, from an example perspective, that happen very often in the workplace, that women and other people obviously get interrupted, but women more often get interrupted than men do and have to contend with that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that example and the way that you were able to break that down and demonstrate both how the external stressor impacts your cognitive load, right? Because when you get interrupted, you've got to stop and and think about, okay, how do I respond? What's my point? And all of those things that are ongoing for an individual that specifically happens a lot with women. What is it that you think is something that we all can do, not just women, but also men in leadership, to help us develop and build our confidence so that when these things happen, they don't have quite as great an impact on us as it might?
Yeah. So in the work that I do with teams and with organizations, I again have a model that I use, and one of them is first is what's unique about you, right? What
Hmm.
are the things? What are the strengths? There's lots of different assessments and tools. So I call myself an evidence-based coach. So I use lots of different psychometric assessments, and it depends on the person and the situation which one that I use. But usually a combination of
So,
something like a leadership
Karen,
profile.
sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
let me ask you: can you explain when you say evidence based? I think
Yeah.
people aren't always clear what that is. Help us understand what that means.
Yeah, so there's different assessments and tools that are out in the, the world. Like Strengths Finder might be one that somebody's familiar with. It's kind of a popular one. Or DISC is very
Hmm.
commonly distributed in organizations. And it helps you understand how you show up. What are the strengths and gifts that you bring that are unique to you? So they're usually self-administered assessments that you take. You get an online form, you fill it out, and it comes back and it tells you a little bit about yourself. And so the evidence there for me is okay, this is not just this person telling me, hey, I'm very assertive, or I'm very direct, or I'm very indirect, I'm very quiet. There's tools that can help me figure that out. So that's the first piece, is what makes you uniquely you. So that's the first phase. The second phase is, how do you then understand others? How do you loop other people in, and how do you understand a group that you're in and what their overall style is? What's the culture of the organization? And those two things help you understand what environment you're operating in.
Hmm.
And then the third piece is unraveling then, okay, what are the things that we're doing as a team or a group that are helping us? And what are the things that we're doing that are getting in our way? And we establish ways of working to overcome those things that may not be working for a team or a group of people trying to work together. And then finally, it's linking all of that to how do we make sure that we're accountable to each other, that we're going to do these things, like we're not going to interrupt each other, or if we do, I'm going to say, hey, I have a clarifying point here, like you did, right? And I want to make sure everybody understands that we go through this process. And so that's one of the things that I think helps build confidence is really understanding yourself and knowing that you're not just like everybody else. There's unique experiences and skills and gifts that you bring to the table that are different than anybody else out there. Nobody else can show up the way that you do. And sometimes it's not the right environment for you to show up in. Sometimes it's not the right culture for you to show up in. But that doesn't mean there's something inherently wrong with you. It just could
Hmm.
be there's a better fit, right? Or it could
Yeah.
be that the organization and the team might need to understand themselves a little bit differently.
Yeah, I love the way that you're describing this, and that you're just basically explaining this and splitting this up. First seek to understand yourself, then seek to understand the culture and the environment that you're working with, and then making sure that you're understanding the things and the activities that you're doing and how they're coming across. I love the way that you split that up. I want to ask you a little bit about some of the work that you do in HR, because I think you are one of the unique guests that we've had that has expertise in working with HR, which is works with human resources, people resources. How is that some of the work that you do there help HR executives and HR leaders help the people in the organization?
Yeah. So the work that I do with HR is varied, but I would say it's around talent management, kind of the broad. So talent management includes things like a lot of organizations will do talent review processes where they're taking a look at all the people that work in the organization and they're saying who has really strong potential, who
Hmm.
is somebody that we could develop into a future leader in this organization. And then they're figuring out the other side of that coin is succession planning. So if a leader is getting ready to exit the organization or is going to exit in a few years, or somebody could get a new job any day, and we have to be
Yeah.
prepared to fill that role, ideally with somebody within the organization, because that's frankly a lot less expensive for organizations, and it also does a great thing for engagement and showing people that there's a path to growth within organizations. So it's helping HR leaders set up those processes to be successful in really managing the talent that is within the organization. The other work I would say is around culture, is understanding the organization's culture. There's again lots of different tools out there that we can use to help with is that a growth culture, and or like let's take private equity for example. That's a unique culture that is really focused on the return on investment for the people that are in the private equity firm versus an organization that's publicly traded, right? They have different. Everybody wants to grow, but
Yeah.
there's different cultures that are associated with that. So really understanding the culture and then understand the people who might thrive in that culture to really help organizations achieve what they want to achieve.
Can you help us, Karen, just make sure that we're all talking about the same thing? Help us understand what you mean by culture,
Yeah.
and why that's important for an organization to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, the simple definition is it's the way we get things done around here. And it's sort of typically the unspoken rules that oftentimes we don't learn until we kind of bump into them. Like, so for
Yeah.
example, a simple question. In your organization, can you email the CEO? You know, in some organizations, that's perfectly acceptable. In other organizations, that would be a huge do not do that.
No. Yeah.
And so it's those unwritten rules. There's also the cognitive culture of an organization, which are the posters on the wall, right? You can look up any organization's website and see what their values are. That's the
Yeah.
cognitive culture. It's very explicit. And then there's the emotional culture of an organization, which is, again, can you be emotional in a meeting? Is that acceptable? Can you,
Hmm.
if you get upset or frustrated, can you shed tears? Right? It all depends on the organization's culture and what is established as a set of norms and rules.
I love that the way that you split that up there again with the cognitive culture. You know, the way that what we're thinking and what we're saying, and then the emotional culture. I think is so important because that's not something that we talk about a lot. You know, when we talk about culture, it's usually about what do we do. But I love what you're talking about with the emotional culture. Can you give us an example of how you've seen that impact an organization when they don't pay attention to emotional culture?
Oh yeah. So um, it results in all kinds of things like people not being happy, low engagement, turnover, right, that type of thing. And just to give
Hmm.
full credit, there's an HBR article on this subject that we can put in the show notes if you want. So they actually came up with those phrases. But
Hmm.
the impact to an organization if they're not paying attention to the emotional culture is pretty extreme. So when we're trying to put a change in place, which is happening all the time in organizations, right? Let's take
Yeah.
AI for example. AI is coming into all kinds of different roles and people are using it in lots of different ways. And there's excitement about that in some ways, and
Hmm.
there's fear about that in other ways. And so, as an organization, if we're not addressing how are we going to use this tool, how is it going to impact the human beings that work in our organization, what might they be afraid of, what might be on their mind when they go to bed at night, we have to address those concerns. And it's not just it's going to be a great business tool. Yes, absolutely. But we always have to
Hmm.
look back and go, what's the impact on people, and what are the types of messages that I need to send to help them work through the change?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that example as well because I think it highlights the impact of emotion on behavior, right? I think we don't always appreciate that the way we're feeling about things impacts the way in which we behave, right? So you can have things like resistance and just things that occur because of the emotions that we're feeling about a certain topic.
Yeah, I mean, people
So
could just
when
leave, right? If they're afraid, they could just leave the company too, which you don't want to have that happen. And you have your best talent walking out because they get fearful.
Yeah, this I mean this is another great example of why it's really important to pay attention to this side of the business, right? The
Mhm.
psychological side, how people are feeling, how it impacts their behavior, things like that. When you're working with HR executives, are you finding that most of them are pretty amenable to this kind of work and the focus on human behavior and psychological concepts, or is it do you get some resistance there?
I think it's mixed. I mean, I think there's always the practical side of like, how are we going to utilize this in a practical way? Because
Hmm.
some psychological concepts and things, it's a hard time translating it. It's also hard to measure it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really the one I think piece that I have to work through is how can people take what we're talking about and practically apply it. And
Hmm.
sometimes that journey or that connection can be challenging depending on the organization that we're working within. But yeah, I think most people are open to it as long as there's a practical application.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's important to make it practical and applicable to the work environment. And so this is why I think it's really important to make sure that we're continually explaining that value proposition.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit about the work that you do with groups because I think that's another groups and teams. I think that's another great venue for this kind of work, right? I know you work with executives and leaders, but tell us about the work that you do with teams and groups.
Yeah. So the sort of after you know yourself, right? It's also you generally none of us work alone anymore, right? We always work with
Hmm.
different people. And so understanding those folks. So there's two folds to this. One is I'll give you an example. There was a group that I was working with and they were struggling with what from a communication facilitation standpoint would be considered, convergent and divergent thinking. So convergent thinking,
Explain those for us. Yeah.
yeah, convergent thinking is when you are opening up, you're brainstorming, right? You're saying, hey, we're open to any and all ideas. And then divergent thinking is, okay, we're going to pick a few of those ideas and we're really going to hone in and make a decision on one of these ideas. In
Mhm.
really fast moving organizations, oftentimes the convergent thinking is, hey, we're open to ideas, but then as soon as those ideas start coming in, they're shot down, right? It's sort of like, no, that's not going to work. No, we tried that 2 years
Yeah.
ago. No.
So not really open.
Yeah, yeah. So it's sort of people get the message very quickly, going back to culture,
Hmm.
that you don't do that, and so you sort of just sit back and wait for the leader to say, what's the idea that we're going to go with, and then we're moving
Yeah.
forward. And so what that really hurts is innovation. It hurts communication. It hurts engagement. And so when you see that happening within a team, and sometimes I do that just through observing. I could go to one of their staff meetings and I sort of see how the leader that I'm working with typically is running their meetings. What are the things that, if they're talking too much, if they're the first ones to talk, if they're the ones throwing out all the ideas and everybody else is just sitting quietly waiting for the decision to be made. And
Yeah.
then some education, right? Like we just talked about, like we have to go through the middle part of the messy middle, as I think Brene
Mhm.
Brown likes to call it, of conversations where we really have to understand people's thinking. And even if we
Mhm.
don't agree with it, we have to push ourselves to listen and then ask them to funnel and start to narrow so that they really feel understood. And so these are all techniques, mostly working with the team leader, but also with the team, to help them understand the way in which they work now, what the shift is that needs to happen, and then how they're going to actually go about doing that. So the specific behaviors and things that they're going to agree to as a team. And often my role in that is playing the role of a facilitator to help them come up with the ideas that they're going to work with, because we all have a bias that we're committed to our own ideas more so than if I just come in and tell you how to do it.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate the work that you do there and helping the group kind of see how they're operating and then help them figure out how they can operate more effectively. I think that's a really great way of doing that. Karen, how do people get a hold of you if they want to continue the conversation or get a hold of your services? What's a good way of contacting you?
Oh yeah, so the best way I think is just find me on LinkedIn. So it's Karyn with a Y, Karyn Edwards, and my website's out there, abloomconsulting.com, and my email address and all that good stuff. You can find it on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And then Karen, I always want to take advantage of the experts we have on the show and ask, what's a tip that you would like to share with businesses, leaders, organizations, especially in this time that we're all in right now?
Yeah, it sort of reminded me of what we were just talking about a little bit with leaders is speak less and speak last.
Hmm.
So that's my biggest tip is really listen to other people. In a leadership role, you have a power dynamic that's going on, and
Hmm.
people are going to yield to you just based on that power dynamic. So if you speak less and speak last, you'll get lots of great ideas out of other people.
Yeah, I love that tip, and I appreciate you bringing that up. That just reminding of those as leaders, there is that power dynamic whether we want it or not, right? And so one of the really great tips on speaking less and speaking last opens up the space for everyone else to be able to speak. So I think that's a great tip. Thank you so much, Karen.
You're welcome.
Well, Karen, thanks for coming on the show. Absolutely love having you on here. I think you're doing fantastic work, and I really appreciate you and the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Ernest. I really appreciate you having me.
Awesome. And to our listeners, thanks for listening. We hope you will join us again next time.